I'm going to start by saying that in December 2015, Singapore officially became a UNESCO creative city, joining the ranks of 115 other cities, right, in 54 countries. That included Bandung, Turin, Detroit, and Budapest. And so it's of note that Singapore was a creative city designated for design. Right. So questions and critiques have routinely come up, right, on whether Singaporeans actually lack creativity or not. And Steve Wozniak's talk in 2011 was one example of that, where he said Apple would never have emerged from Singapore, right, because Singapore is too straight-laced, right, and formal in its culture. And the UNESCO designation signaled that basically the state is pretty much for creativity as business, right? Obviously, the creative industries is a driving force for these sort of post-industrial economies. But also, I like to think about the UNESCO designation as thinking about an opportunity for Singapore to endorse its program, right? As it states that cultural industries actually promote citizen and cultural participation and approaches the public sphere with a new perspective that public authorities in cooperation with private sector and civil society can make the difference and support a more sustainable urban development suited to the practical needs of the local population. So in this talk, I'm just going to briefly survey figures of design, right, in three instances. One is Tim Kobe's Straits Times article with respect to the Design Master Plan 2025, also the Future of Us exhibition that Han Hao has just mentioned. And also, I'm going to give a shout out to the Future Fridays session for Sustainable Living Lab that the dinner is going to be held at, right? So I would like to think about these cases as starting points, right? To think about how design is now foregrounded in Singaporean culture, right? As opposed to the more kind of traditional rationalist planning approach. Now we have this more inclusive, encompassing notion of design. So this shift has no doubt been influenced by academic and industry kind of developments, right? That now expands the domain of design into design thinking and more ethnographic approaches. But I think more specifically, it recasts Singaporean culture associated with efficiency and planning under constraints, right, into a productive narrative of innovation that then becomes part of the Singaporean urban brand. So in the Future of Us exhibition, the figure of design also communicates the state's desire to incorporate more social inclusivity in its approaches towards public problems, as we see from the figure of the disabled designer. And the design-related sessions of Future Fridays offer a glimpse of how design practices can be shared on a public level. But ultimately, the questions remains, right? So what exactly changes? Who gets to dream design, and at what scale? And how should one design? And what are these civic possibilities and limitations, right, of design? So in March this year, a piece by Tim Kobe, the founder and CEO of strategic design firm 8 Inc., was published in the Straits Times that introduced the new Design 2025 Master Plan via an homage to the late Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew. So in this piece, Kobe, who's a member of the Master Plan Committee, communicates the Master Plan's vision for Singapore to be a thriving, innovation-driven economy and a livable city by design. So if you note from the quotation that I've taken here, he says, from conception through to execution, virtually every aspect of life in Singapore seems to have created through a considered intentional process. And I find it interesting how he basically compares business innovation, of course surpassed by the innovation of a country, but also in thinking about how Singapore is a design success and how Lee Kuan Yew has essentially created a human experience that connects people and their activities with the environment. So while Lee has often been called the architect of modern Singapore, Kobe's description of him as a designer is new in that sense, right? Which suggests a recasting of Lee's nation-building legacy from more of a modernist structural planner of the environment to a designer who creates human experiences and complex systems and problems and solutions. So at this point of time, it will be good to kind of recall the hard pragmatism and efficiency that Lee espoused when modernizing and cleaning up the city with his disciplinary schemes, right, that basically allowed this to happen in a very short time. And so this attitude of hard pragmatism also undergirds Singapore's long-term centralized top-down approach to urban planning, as exemplified in the concept plan, master plan mechanism. So incorporating analysis of data, modeling, and forecasting, the concept plan projects Singapore's land use and transportation infrastructure in the next 40 to 50 years that lays out Singapore's development, which then is translated into the master plan, which lays out Singapore's development in the next 10 to 15 years. So at the basis, this mechanism is driven by physical constraints of land scarcity and the acknowledgement that long-term planning is necessary because, I quote, there is simply no room to plan a new city. So while contemporary designer discourse, with its human and user-centered focuses, seemingly differs from the rationalist mode of top-down urban planning, the continuing thread between both planning and design is in the notion of problem-solving, right, with the realities of constraints translated into conditions of possibility for innovation. So here we see the Design 2025 Master Plan Committee members' comments, and I note how he has sort of emptied design out from a sense of aesthetics or self-expression, and he says that design is about problem solving, right? You can walk into a hardware shop and find good design solutions there, even though it's not aesthetically pleasing. And this narrative of design as functional problem solving then has become a brand in itself, right? It's recently listed in the Wall Street Journal. Singapore has been noted for its infrastructural ability to, I quote, manage extremely limited resources. So this supports Singapore's existing urban brand of urban planning and architectural expertise that is already being exported to developing cities through infrastructural consultancies like Sabana Jurong. But I think also what Singapore's turn to design, right, offers this idea of developing its own softer elements of culture. So these softer elements are embodied in the 4 characters that feature in the Future of Us exhibition, the film that was mentioned. So I'm not going to go into many details about this exhibition, but one thing to note is that these 4 characters, besides featuring the usual breakdown of racial representation, the designer, Eason, arguably, is the heart of this film because she starts narrating and she stands out, right, given her disabled status. So she is basically emblematic of what design and technology can do, right? She surmounts physical limitations and creates environments like the future play space. And also in this film, because it harkens back to a previous generation, like grandparents, her grandparent is a teacher, right? So again, this sort of extension of design as education, right, which was the main means of getting Singaporeans employment in the 1960s. So while the film displays a broader notion of social inclusivity, one question that the film raises is that if Singaporeans are being told the same narrative as in the 1960s, the message of the Theatre of Generations, the film, is the repeated phrase, quote, "The future is not set, just as the past is not," harkening back to the improbability of Singapore's success and its surmounting of challenges. But along with generational continuity, the roles of Singaporeans have not fundamentally changed. It's just that the technologies seem to be the more advanced version of it, right? So this raises a question of what is being expected of the designer and his visions of the future, especially where they will be situated within the state's still large overarching plans, right? What changes can the designer bring about in a city that remains constrained by its narrative of physical and demographic limitations? So I'm going to also introduce the Sustainable Living Lab at this point for its Future Fridays session that offers a glimpse of how design pedagogy can be used to understand and project possible futures centered around the current and projected trends and problems such as citizen science and automation. So the Sustainable Living Lab is essentially the innovation lab of the makerspace, one maker group, right, a local makerspace here. And they essentially are open to the public, the Future Friday sessions. Although the lab itself offers, a regular range of learning journeys, etc., to schools and other kind of organizations. So what I find interesting about the Sustainable Living Lab is really that it's located in the National Design Center, right? But where it sort of sticks out a bit as compared to all the rest of the more aesthetically pleasing designs, right? But at the same time, it's hardly any this sort of cultural space that Steve Wozniak, would espouse, right? It still follows the state's program of, commercial, social, educational innovation, right? But what I would like to think about is how it offers an outlet for teaching individuals speculative design that engages the process of making, right, with narrative and its deconstruction, right? So, hang on. Oh, okay. So you get these sort of elements where the participants are actually allowed to come up with what they call artifacts of the future. And these are more whimsical kind of projects, right? They're not really kind of instrumental kind of innovations, right? And so I'm suggesting that there is some sort of transformative subjective experience that is offered, right, for the individual to kind of take over making and planning and thinking about design, right, and reclaiming a sense of creativity. Okay, thank you.